Well, my talk's going to be slightly different approach, but before I start, I'd like to thank the 1 Million Signatures campaign for inviting me, and thank the organizers in particular. It's a lovely event, and I'm honored to be invited. These are indeed potentially very revolutionary times for women, and a very, very exciting time. Even though we read and hear these grim statistics, the fact is that that something's on the horizon, and I think we all feel it. It has been for some time. This is not something sudden. This has been building up. Now, I know I was invited on this panel because I teach and write about women in conflict zones, and I write about women's organizations and women's movements. And also because I research and write on Sudan and Eritrea, two areas of rich and profound women's activities. For Sudanese women, this is absolutely the most exciting time in their history. I'm not actually going to be talking about Sudan all that much, but I want to make a few comments. They're poised to change the conditions of their lives in profound ways, especially the women of the Republic of South Sudan. As most of you know, or some of you know, there was a referendum in January in which the Southern Sudanese voted to separate from Northern Sudanese. A tragic event, but one completely understandable. At any rate, Sudan is also of interest because of the role of women in various conflicts. In the civil war between the North and South, in the struggle in the Nuba Mountains, and in Darfur. As fighters, as they call them in Eritrea, as paramedics, peacemakers, politicians, and just about every other role. But also because Sudanese women have always had strong organizations. For a long time, these organizations were commonly affiliated with political parties such as the Communist Party or the Ansar, the Mahdist Party, and so on. But more recently, women have worked on behalf of women in a plethora of feminist NGOs that are opposing various policies of the Islamist government, and have been working among those who to maintain coalitions across the North-South divide, aiming to unite women even after the official secession on July 7th. These are the most valuable resources the country has, in fact, that both of these countries have, North and what will be the Republic of South Sudan. These are women who've been working under extremely dangerous circumstances. Things have lightened up a little bit in Sudan, but they're about to tighten up again any day. And most of us suspect that Northern Sudanese will be in trouble. Perhaps more on that in our discussion session. Eritrea is of interest because women constituted some 40% of the combat guerrilla force during the Eritrean People's Liberation Front struggle against Ethiopia for independence. That was a 30-year-long war, and women were very prominent as fighters. But also, women served in every capacity in this struggle, from being liaison agents, so to speak, to combat positions. They were medics, radio transmitters, truck drivers, child care workers, etc., across the board. And Eritrea is of interest to many of us who write on social movements because the revolutionary movement has suffered major setbacks, as have women. In other words, the revolution has collapsed. Its state is oppressive as many other states you could name. Looking at the lessons of the past, one can add Eritrea to the long list of revolutions that in the long run have failed women. However, let me back up for a moment and discuss some background themes of women in revolution, conflict, war, occupation, and genocide. All important subjects right now because in the Middle East and Africa, we're seeing all of these. The current stress on these themes of women in motion has come about because feminist scholars and activists and others finally discovered that women have agency, and stopped talking about women only as being acted upon, as being passive observers, as being victims, really. But also the theme and topic has currency because there are more and more social movements and conflicts that are taking place around the world, conflicts that are endless, and increasingly women are involved in these conflicts as never before, and in many cases are playing leadership roles. This is a perfect opportunity to explore the urgent contemporary development shaped by the intersections of gender, conflict, and militarism. We need to examine the nature and rationales for violence, the nature and rationales for torture, for imprisonment, for militarization and masculinity, the politics of memory, politics of naming, I'll mention that in a moment, trauma and healing, and forms of reconciliation and human rights. In the last couple of decades, we've been able to observe viable movements in which women have played major roles in Palestine, in various areas where we find Kurds, in Algeria, Sudan, Mexico with the Zapatistas, Lebanon, Eritrea, Tunisia, Egypt, Philippines, South Africa, and under very, very difficult circumstances in Afghanistan and Iraq. In the past, scholars wrote about women in war situations in which they were mainly seen either as the Greek choruses or the muses that were there to kind of encourage the men, the male warriors, or they were seen as victims. Some of us wrote about and are still writing about women in revolutionary movements or parties, about resistance and subversive activities, and about insurgency and counterinsurgency. Expanded analyses see women as actors in multiple roles: warriors, victims, pawns, perpetrators, subversives, survivors, collaborators, icons or symbols, and combinations of these. What I'm mainly trying to do today is to stress the fact that we need to nuance our interpretations and analyses of women in these various conflicts, in these various struggles, rather than just seeing them as glorious people or as victims. On a more concrete level, women may work in humanitarian relief, be mediators, peacemakers, justice seekers, and of course, human rights advocates. We've begun to nuance our studies and observations more and realize that in various conflict situations, women may play ambivalent roles in the Homi Bhabha sense of the word. Sorry for the academic nonsense. Women may also be complicit. We don't like to think of women as complicit in negative things, but it can be. And they may have very complicated relationships with their adversaries. Just as we're not always victims, we're not always heroes. Let me address myself to earlier studies of women in conflict zones, because then we can also understand the evolution of our thinking about women's roles. In other words, studies by the first generation of people who worked on war and struggle and conflict. They were profoundly influenced by European conflict theorists, not just Marx, but a number of conflict theorists. And a generation of scholars of war and liberation struggles when it came to looking at gender aspects of war or revolution. These dialectical interpretations that they had inherited from the European conflict theorists were very limited. Other forms of modernist paradigms took precedence. The modernist frame that was the rubric for war studies was an emancipatory narrative with a linear timeline, spatially contained and individualistic in approach. Studies were teleological, that is, moral end, or looking for a moral end, and also very individualistic in approach. The themes that dominated were oppression, equality, and liberation in their variations. If there was oppression, then the situation was dichotomized into oppressor and oppressed. Or if there was colonialism, it was dichotomized into colonized and the colonizer, or the occupier and the occupied. We didn't seem to be able to see any nuances or any ambivalence or whatever. We dichotomized all these situations, these early studies. It almost goes without saying that more isolated, less documented forms of resistance, such as slave revolts, for example, did not fit into the modernist frame that prevailed in all these early studies. Not only were individual acts of resistance discounted, like spitting in the lemonade, but even the rebellions of small groups of people, or spontaneous revolts, or grassroots movements, and so on, were discounted. The emphasis began to be on women's movements, and these were often defined or described in particular ways. They had to be large in number, they had to exist over a longer period of time, they had to be organized, they had to consist of a number of organizations, and they had to be multi-ideological. The concept of revolution was rarely ever dealt with. I wonder why. Early studies saved little room for human agency. If women were even in the frame at all, they were seen as acted upon, as I said earlier. For some time, studies of colonialism, for example, and colonial wars of liberation, simply excluded women. And it was only by the 1960s that colonized women were even mentioned. And this was only to make one of 3 points. Either we saw what, or we tried to show what colonialism did for women, or we tried to show what colonialism did to women. And only sometime later we began to see studies of how women resisted colonialism. Totally omitted until nearly the 21st century were studies of how women of the colonizer and women of the colonized often collaborated. Or even later, in contemporary and ongoing research, we've begun to see studies of the ways in which colonial women were complicit in colonialism, not to mention the complicity and collaboration of colonized women and the differences among categories of women by race and class. I mean, this derives from the theme of how women often further their own oppression or the oppression of other women. And it's a follow-up of that. We don't like to think of that, it's negative and so on. But nonetheless, it's important to look at it when it's in front of us. In these earlier studies, war and genocide were seen as pathologies with a beginning and an end, not as perpetual conflict that functioned in complex ways, ramifying through social structure and part of empire. In many ways, the presence or absence of women or gender studies of war reflected the trajectory of early academic women's studies, so they were almost parallel. In other words, in women's studies, we moved from dealing with the absence of women, oh, there are no women here, and then the restoration of women, look, there was a woman there. And we moved from presenting women as victims to celebrating women or thinking of women as heroes and so on. That's the trajectory of our field. I think we're somewhere else now, but not until quite recently. Therefore, in war and movement studies, there was first the process of showing that women were excluded from war, such as the study of the exclusion from the military, some of Cynthia Enlow's early work, or that women were left at home without understanding this as an element of war culture or as an extension of the war effort. A bit later, we began to see studies of how women were treated when included in war or in the military. In other words, how they were included. Were they only included in the military as nurses, or what were referred to in the American military as irregulars, such as scouts, spies, liaisons. In fact, positions that often just reinforced the stereotype of women. Most studies of women and war, genocide. And I should be separating these, but I can't for a short presentation. Most studies have portrayed women as victims. In previous studies, we would see women in military prisons, concentration camps, refugee camps. Sometimes we would see women being caught under occupation, who were nurses, missionaries, teachers, and so on. Later, Cynthia Enlow and others demonstrated the impact of military bases on the existence of military bases on women, part of the traffic in women argument. And even in studies of women left at home, in the end, they were portrayed as victims. For example, those who lost their jobs when men returned from the war, usually totally discounting women's contribution to the military-industrial complex. At one point in the war, in World War II, in the United States, all over about a third of the world, the number of women casualties in military production jobs actually outnumbered the number of men killed or hurt in the war itself, and that's hardly known. So women working in the war front at home, working in war at home, were given very little credit. I better see what I can skip. Well, earlier studies of women in revolution or liberation movements have not been much different. My own, as a self-critique, my own early modernist studies, starting in the 70s and 1980s, portrayed women of the Sudanese Communist Party, their exclusion or their selective recruitment. I called them the Greek chorus of the movement. I wasn't observing what it was they were doing behind the scenes, even though they were sharing some of these things with me. I also talked about their protected status. I was interpreting them, this was in the very early 1980s. I was interpreting them as an auxiliary of the main party. I called it the wing of the patriarch at the time. I have an article by that name, The Wing of the Patriarch. Well, now I'm trying to put women back into the social fabric, to show conflict as perpetual, to portray the complex relationship to men in the struggle, to show the ways in which gender roles are changing during the struggle, and so on. I think that in the past we've shown a kind of gender exceptionalism with regard to women. We've inherited that from Middle East studies in general. It's time for more complexity, as I keep saying. Well, it may be valid to portray women as victims in certain conflicts. At the same time, we should also be cognizant of the kind of space that's created for women in these struggles. New situations emerge for them, new opportunities emerge. And that's very, very important. It gets overlooked a great deal of the time. I would imagine, for example, that in these struggles we're seeing now, they're too new for us to analyze them, but in Egypt and Tunisia and so on, we will soon find that women not only were in the vanguard of the movements, but that situations changed for them after the movement. For one thing, one of the effects that these kinds of movements can have on women is raised self-esteem. And even if they themselves have been victimized in particular ways or excluded in particular ways, the fact that they've served in these revolutionary movements, these liberation struggles, often causes them to raise their their daughters differently. And so we have a second generation to think about in terms of raised self-esteem, the sense of self-empowerment, and so on. These are very, very important. Well, I'm not quite sure what I might consider important might not be what you might consider important. So I was going to talk a bit about gender-based sexual violence, what that's about women's bodies being written on as political acts, and what that's about, with special reference to Sudan and Darfur and the Nuba Mountains and so on. But also, I want to say that the rhetoric of the war on terror has frequently disseminated received codes of gender, having the effect of rigidifying what already exists, or extending or distorting or exacerbating them. For example, the discourse of women's rights was loudly invoked by U.S. feminists, the popular media, and others to justify the U.S.-led invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. I put a lot of blame at the feet of U.S. feminists for these struggles. Not the entire blame, that would be a little naive, but a lot of the blame. But the effect of women of these arrogant interventions is again under-researched and under-theorized. The struggle to construct and secure a new Iraq, for example, has involved an intense and rigorous policing of gender roles and gender roles. Iraqi women's bodies have, in effect, become markers of non-Western morals, politics, and statehood, at the same time that women's bodies are subject to Western sexist ideologies. The ironic consequences of the U.S. intervention has been a mass disenfranchisement of Iraqi women at all levels in employment and education, effectively removing women from much of public life, a distinct change from large regions of pre-invasion Iraq. I'm ending now. It remains to be seen if the newer liberation movements, such as the Tunisian, Egyptian, Yemenis, don't we hope, Libyan, don't we hope, uprisings we're seeing today will be spaces where we will see new women's activities, ones where they've learned from the lessons of the past and can move ahead. And I join with Rima in saying that that events of this sort is a part of moving ahead. Thank you.